Facebook.
I got a friend request from Chris on Facebook. Well, one thing led to another, and he's the best thing that has ever happened to me. And because of my health challenges, because I got so sick, I let him in.
His neighbors liked him. That is the thing that is almost impossible to get past when you read the accounts from the people who lived around Chris Watts. They liked him. They described him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who waved from the driveway, who talked to you about your lawn if you asked, who showed up to neighborhood events and stood near the edge and smiled and never caused any trouble, who was, by every observable measure, exactly the kind of person you want living next door to you. One neighbor told investigators he paid attention to those kids, that he was always out there with Bella and Celeste, that he seemed, by all evidence, visible from a driveway or across a cul-de-sac, like a genuinely devoted father. Another neighbor said she was in absolute shock when she heard the news. She had seen him with the girls at the neighborhood pool. The nicest man in the neighborhood buried his kids in an oil tank. Not metaphorically, not in the way people talk about. Someone being a monster in disguise, literally. On August 13th, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts placed his 4-year-old daughter Bella and his 3-year-old daughter Celeste inside crude oil storage tanks at a remote Anadarko petroleum worksite 11 miles from the house where they had lived their entire lives. He drove home. He made coffee. He went to work. He stood in his driveway and gave a television interview asking for his family to come home. And his neighbors, the people who had waved at him, who had seen him at the pool, who had thought he seemed like a genuinely devoted father, had absolutely no idea. Tonight we are going to talk about the neighborhood, about what it saw, about what it missed, about why the nicest man on the street is sometimes the most dangerous person in it. The house, the street, the life, the neighborhood believed in. Frederick. Colorado is a small town of approximately 14,000 to 15,000 people, situated about 27 miles north of Denver in Weld County. It is the kind of town that grew fast in the early 2000s as Denver's suburban sprawl pushed northward. New subdivisions, new schools, new cul-de-sacs, full of houses that all looked roughly similar and cost roughly similar amounts, and were filled with roughly similar families at roughly similar stages of life. Young couples, starter homes upgraded to family homes, kids in driveways, barbecues in summer, Christmas lights in December. 2,825 Saratoga Trail was in the middle of all of that. A 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom home purchased by Chris and Shanann Watts in April 2013 for approximately $393,000. By the standards of the neighborhood, it was a solidly family-sized house. Big enough to feel like they had arrived somewhere, not so big as to stand out. The Watts family fit the neighborhood the way families fit neighborhoods when everything on the outside is working. They had 2 daughters, then were expecting a 3rd child. Shanann ran her Thrive by Level health and wellness business from home and documented her family's life relentlessly on social media. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, leaving for his shift in the early morning and returning in the afternoon with the particular, quiet, tired competence of a man who did physical work all day and came home and helped with the kids. Neighbors described the family as normal, as pleasant, as the kind of people who were there without being intrusive. Nobody had a bad word to say about Chris Watts. That last sentence deserves more attention than it usually gets. Nobody. Not a single person in the neighborhood, in the investigative record, in the documented accounts of those who knew the family from the street or from the school or from the local shops.
They had a great marriage.
Not one of them offered an account of Chris Watts that raised a flag. That suggested something was wrong. That indicated, even in hindsight, that there had been moments of visible anger, visible coldness, visible cruelty. He was the nicest man in the neighborhood. He was also, on August 13th, 2018, the man who loaded the bodies of his wife and daughters into his truck before sunrise and drove them to an oil field. Both of those things are true, and the gap between them is what this documentary is about. When investigators began canvassing Saratoga Trail in the hours and days after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, On August 13th, 2018, they spoke to the people who had lived next to, across from, and within sight of the Watts family home. The accounts they collected form one of the most revealing documents in this case. Not because of what the neighbors reported seeing, because of what they did not. Mike Hendrickson, a neighbor who lived nearby, described the Watts family as very quiet people and very nice, cordial people. He specifically said he had admired Chris for the attention he paid to his daughters. Another neighbor said she was in absolute shock, that she had seen the family together, that nothing had seemed wrong. The neighbor, whose security camera captured the most important footage in the entire case, the video showing Chris Watts loading his truck in the early morning hours of August 13th at approximately 5:15 a.m., had no idea what they were capturing. They had a camera because they had a camera, not because they were watching, not because they had any reason to watch. That camera is one of the pivotal pieces of evidence that broke this case open. Without it, the timeline of August 13th would have been harder to establish. Without it, the moment of loading, the moment when Chris Watts moved Shanann's body, would have remained unverifiable. It exists because of a coincidence of installation, not because anyone suspected anything, because no one suspected anything. The neighborhood saw exactly what Chris Watts needed it to see. A man who waved from the driveway, a man who showed up to the pool with his kids, a man who was, by every visible measure, exactly who he appeared to be. The neighborhood saw the performance. It had no instrument for detecting what was underneath it. No neighborhood does. There is a specific phrase that appears with almost mechanical regularity in the aftermath of intimate partner homicide cases. He was the nicest guy. He was so quiet. I never would have thought. He seems so normal. This phrase, in its many variations, appears in cases from Scott Peterson to Chris Coleman to Neil Entwistle to Chris Watts. It is so common that forensic researchers and behavioral analysts have begun studying it not as evidence that the perpetrator was undetectable, but as a feature of the perpetrator's operational profile. The niceness is not incidental. The niceness is the mechanism. Here is what the behavioral literature on intimate partner homicide says about men who commit familicide, the killing of a spouse and children, and are subsequently described by their community as non-threatening, pleasant, and unremarkable. They are almost universally men who have an extreme aversion to direct conflict. Not men who lack conflict, men who lack the internal architecture to express it. Men who absorb everything, deflect everything, perform contentment as a survival strategy because genuine confrontation feels to them catastrophically threatening. This is not passivity. It is a specific form of emotional suppression that, over time, produces enormous internal pressure with no legitimate outlet. The niceness is the lid on a container that was always filling. Chris Watts was described by people who knew him across multiple contexts, school, work, marriage, as non-confrontational to an unusual degree. He never raised his voice. He never started arguments. He deflected. He agreed. He smiled. When Shanann documented tension in their marriage in the texts and communications that became part of the investigative record, she described a man who had become emotionally unavailable, who refused to engage, who said he was not compatible with her anymore, and then refused couples counseling. He did not argue with her. He did not fight for the marriage. He did not tell her clearly and directly that it was over so that she could make informed decisions about her life. He built a parallel life instead, and when the parallel life became unsustainable, he chose the option that required no confrontation at all. The nicest man in the neighborhood had never learned how to say a hard thing to another person. So instead of saying, "I want a divorce," he said nothing, and did something no sentence in the English language is adequate to describe. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, Chris Watts had been awake since before 2 a.m. He had killed his wife in the master bedroom of their home. He had loaded her body into his truck at approximately 5:15 a.m., captured by his neighbor's security camera. He had driven to the Survey 319 oil site with Shanann's body and his living daughters in the back seat. He had buried Shanann in a shallow grave and placed Bella and Celeste inside crude oil storage tanks. He had driven home. And then he had gone about his day. He called the girls' school to say they would not be coming in. He texted his supervisor to say he would be late. He went to work. At approximately 12:10 p.m., Shanann's close friend, Nicole Utoft Atkinson, arrived at 2825 Saratoga Trail. Shanann had not responded to calls or texts all morning. She had missed a prenatal appointment that morning. Nicole had driven her home from the airport less than 12 hours earlier and knew immediately that something was wrong. Chris Watts answered the door. He was calm. He told Nicole that Shanann had left, that they had had a disagreement, that she had probably taken the girls somewhere. His choice of language was noted by investigators. He used the word disagree. Not fight, not argument. Disagree. A word calibrated to describe something minor, something resolvable, something that ends. Nicole pushed. She called police. Officer Cody Nunn arrived at approximately 1:40 p.m. Chris Watts met him outside, walked him through the house, gave permission for the search with the ease of a man who had nothing to hide. And then, while Shanann's phone was between the sofa cushions, while her keys and purse were still in the house, while her car was in the garage with the girls' car seats in it, Chris Watts walked outside, into the neighborhood, into the street he had shared with these people for 5 years, and he gave a television interview.
Watts, WATTS. It's got K9 units, the sheriff's department. Everybody's like they're doing their best right now to figure out like if they can get a scent, see where they went. If they went on foot, they went in a car, or they went somewhere. And right now it's just like they've been on point. They're going through the house trying to get a scent, and hopefully they can pick something up to where it's going to lead to something. She came home from the airport 2 a.m. and I left around 5:15. She was still here, and like about 12:10 in that afternoon, her friend Nicole showed up at the door. Like I had texted Shanann a few times that day, called her, say but she never got back to me.
Reference: Chris Watts' televised interview on the driveway of 2825 Saratoga Trail, August 13, 2018. His voice is level. His body language is controlled. He says he wants his family back. Watch that interview. Watch it understanding that he had loaded his daughters into a truck before sunrise. Watch it understanding that Bella had been alive when he closed the tank hatch. Watch it understanding that he knew precisely, specifically, geographically, where they were while he stood in that driveway and said he wanted them back. And then, understand this, the neighbors were watching. Some of them were standing nearby, some of them were at their windows. The entire neighborhood was, in that moment, his audience. And he gave them the same performance he had been giving them for 5 years. The quiet man, the concerned man, the man who just wanted his family home. The nicest man in the neighborhood, standing in his driveway, performing for the street, while his daughters were 11 miles away in the dark. Here is something that gets lost in the neighborhood framing of this case. Shanann Watts was not fooled, not entirely, not in the way that the neighborhood was fooled. From a distance, from a driveway wave, from a pool visit. She was living inside the marriage. She felt it changing. She said so. The investigative documents released in this case include text message exchanges between Shanann and Chris Watts from the weeks and months leading up to August 13th, 2018. They are among the most painful documents in the public record of this case. Shanann texted Chris from North Carolina, where she had spent the summer with Bella and Celeste at her parents' home, asking what was wrong, telling him she felt the distance, telling him she loved him and wanted to understand what was happening. She wrote, "I don't know how you fell out of love with me in 5.5 weeks, or if this has been going on for a long time." She wrote, "You show up and I have to practically ask for a kiss at the airport." She wrote, "If you are done, don't love me, don't want to work this out. I need you to tell me." He did not tell her. He gave minimal responses, flat acknowledgments, the kind of communication that manages rather than engages. She told friends something was wrong. She told a friend that Chris had said they were not compatible anymore, that he had refused to hug her, that he had said he thought another baby would fix his feelings.
Appointment in 2 hours. I know. Boy, Chris wants a boy. I hope it's a boy for him. It'll make him happy. That's just the test.
And now acknowledged it had not, that he had refused couples counseling. Her friends tried to plan a gender reveal party for August 19th, a week after the murders. She canceled it on August 8th, 5 days before she died. A friend texted to ask if everything was okay. She replied, no. She knew something was wrong with the marriage. She did not know, could not have known, had no framework to construct, that the man she was trying to reach was already, in his mind and in his behavior, operating in a world where she and their daughters did not exist. The neighborhood did not see the problem. Shanann saw it, but only through the fog of a marriage she still believed was salvageable, with a man she still believed was the person she had married. The performance he gave the street, he gave her too, just a different version of it, one that said, I am a struggling husband. Not, I have already decided. I have spent this entire documentary building toward something, toward the gap between the man the neighborhood knew and the thing the man did. And I want to be direct about it now, because the title of this video is not rhetorical. It is the most accurate sentence that can be constructed about Chris Watts. The nicest man in the neighborhood buried his kids in an oil tank. Let me be specific about what that means. The Survey 319 oil site is a remote Anadarko petroleum property in Weld County, Colorado, approximately 11 miles from the Watts family home. It was one of the work sites Chris Watts serviced. As part of his job as a field operator, he knew it was remote. He knew that on an early Monday morning before the workday began, there would be no one there. He chose it deliberately. The crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319 had access hatches with openings of approximately 8 inches in diameter. 8 inches. Chris Watts forced the bodies of his daughters through openings 8 inches wide. Bella was 4 years old, Celeste was 3. He forced them through 8-inch openings into tanks of crude oil. Hold. Long silence. Do not rush past this. The forensic evidence recovered from the tank where Bella Watts was found indicated that she had regained consciousness after being placed inside. She had been alive. She was 4 years old. She was alone. In the dark, in crude oil, in a tank with an 8-inch opening. And her father, the nicest man in the neighborhood, was 11 miles away driving home. Shanann Watts was buried in a shallow grave nearby. She was 15, weeks pregnant. Their son, the boy they had named Nico, was buried with her. The same man who waved from the driveway, the same man who showed up to the pool, the same man who neighbors described as quiet, polite, devoted. The same man who stood in the street on August 13th, 2018, and gave a television interview about wanting his family home. That man, those tanks, 8-inch openings, a 4-year-old who was still alive. The neighborhood did not know. It could not have known. It had no way of knowing. That is the whole point. The investigation that brought Chris Watts down was not, in the end, built on a witness who saw something suspicious. It was not built on a neighbor who noticed something wrong. It was built on a friend who knew Shanann well enough to understand that a woman who never left her phone unattended, who never missed a prenatal appointment, who texted her friends multiple times a day, that woman would not simply disappear without contact. Nicolay, Atkinson's decision to push on August 13th, Puntai, to call police to refuse to accept the explanation Chris Watts offered, was the first crack in the performance. The neighbor's security camera footage, which captured Chris Watts loading his truck at 5:15 a.m., was the second. Law enforcement bodies joining the investigation that day included the Frederick Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. An endangered missing alert was issued. Chris Watts was administered a polygraph on August 13th, which he failed. The examiner concluding deception indicated. Investigators did not stop. On August 15th, 2018, investigators confronted Chris Watts with the neighbor's security camera footage. He confessed. He was arrested that same day. On August 16th, the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were recovered from the Survey 319 oil site. Shanann was found in a shallow grave. The girls were recovered from inside the crude oil storage tanks. The neighborhood found out the way most of the world found out, through the news. The quiet man, the devoted father, the guy who waved from the driveway, he had been arrested for murdering his wife and daughters. The shock was, by every reported account, total. And the shock itself is the lesson. Because if the shock is total, if the community closest to a man has absolutely no framework for what he was capable of, then the performance was complete. The mask was perfect. The neighborhood never had a chance. What the law determined. what the community was left with. Chris Watts was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, along with additional counts for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, for the death of Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. On November 6, 2018, he pleaded guilty to all charges as part of a plea agreement that removed the death penalty from sentencing. On November 19, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 to be served consecutively for the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and 2 served concurrently, plus 84 additional years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He is currently incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail went into foreclosure. The family had already been behind on mortgage payments before the murders and was eventually auctioned and sold. The neighborhood continued. Children still play in driveways on Saratoga Trail. People still wave from their lawns. The pool is still there. On November 18, 2019, Weld County Judge Todd Taylor ordered Chris Watts to pay $6 million in wrongful death damages to Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razuchek. $1 million for each of the 3 deaths and $3 million for emotional pain and suffering, growing at 8% annual interest. He will never pay it. He has no assets. The judgment exists as a formal legal document of what he owes and cannot give. Shanann's parents have spoken publicly about the ongoing devastation to their family, about the harassment from online conspiracy theorists, about the experience of having their daughter's case become entertainment, about what it means to lose a child and 2 grandchildren and then watch the man who killed them become a subject of fascination. They asked people to remember Shanann, to remember Bella and Celeste, to say their names. This documentary is trying to do that. I want to say something that will be uncomfortable for some people. The neighborhood could not have stopped this. Let me be clear, I am not blaming the neighborhood. I am not suggesting that the people of Saratoga Trail failed. I am not arguing that anyone missed something they should have caught. I am saying something different. I am saying that the way we have built our communities, or the way we have organized our streets and our social norms and our expectations of what a good neighbor looks like, is specifically structured to be invisible to this kind of danger. We reward the man who waves from the driveway. We like the man who shows up to the pool. We feel good about the street where the kids play and the fathers seem present and the houses are maintained and nobody causes trouble. We have built a social architecture that validates exactly the behaviors Chris Watts excelled at. And that architecture has no instrument for measuring what happens inside a house, inside a marriage, inside the mind of a man who has learned to perform contentment so completely that even the woman sleeping next to him cannot see through it until it is almost too late. The warning signs in this case were not on the street. They were in the text messages Shanann sent from North Carolina. They were in the conversations she had with her friends about a husband who had gone cold. They were in the canceled gender reveal party. They were in the flat, minimal responses he gave when she reached for him. Those warning signs were not visible to the neighborhood. They were barely visible to Shanann. Because the man she was trying to reach was a man she had 8 years of real documented evidence to believe was safe. And the neighbors had 5 years of driveway waves. Both groups were working with incomplete information. Only one of them was in danger. The lesson of this case is not that we should distrust our neighbors. The lesson is that the performance of niceness, the surface behavior we use to evaluate the people around us, is not a reliable indicator of what is happening underneath it, and that the people most at risk from the man who seems the nicest are not the neighbors. They are the family inside the house, the ones who cannot escape the performance because they live inside it. The case of Chris Watts has generated more coverage, more content, more analysis than almost any domestic homicide in recent American history. His name is searchable. His case is documented. His psychology has been studied, debated, profiled, monetized. His neighbors remember him. The whole country knows his name. I want to spend the last minutes of this documentary on the 4 people whose names should be better known than his. Shanann Catherine Watts was born on January 10, 1984, in Passaic County, New Jersey. She was raised in Aberdeen, North Carolina. She was 34 years old. She had survived lupus. She had survived a blood clot that nearly killed her. She had built a business from nothing. She had raised 2 daughters who, by every documented account, were joyful and vivid and fully themselves. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a son she was planning to call Nico. She texted her friends from Arizona the week she died about how much she was looking forward to coming home. She did not come home. Bella Marie Watts was born on December 17, 2013. She was 4 years and nearly 8 months old. She was, by her mother's documented account and the account of everyone who knew her, a specific and forceful small person, opinionated about her clothes, devoted to her sister, absolutely certain about whatever she had decided was important at any given moment. She asked questions in the truck on the way to Survey 319. She told her father she did not want to die. She was 4 years old. Celeste Catherine Watts was born on July 17, 2015. She was 3 years old. She was called Cece. She was sweet and silly and had the particular quality of 3-year-olds who are still learning. The world is mostly safe and mostly good, which it was for her right up until it wasn't. Nico Lee Watts was never born. He was 15 weeks old. His due date was January 31, 2019. He would have been the boy in a family of girls, and his mother was, by the documented record of her texts and videos, overwhelmed with happiness about that. These are the 4 people this documentary is about. Not the nicest man in the neighborhood, not the performance he gave the street, not the mask. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Say those names, not his. If this video made you think, share it. Not for the views, for Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, for Nico. Subscribe for more documentaries that go past the headline and into the truth. And if you or someone you know is in a relationship that doesn't feel safe, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-79-97233. Available 24 hours a day. Real people, they will answer.